Welcome to Communications Breakdown, where we break down what works and doesn't in health and science communication. I'm Katrina Boylan, and as you might have noticed, it's just me today, no Tracy Meehan. Unfortunately, Tracy's out on leave, but she'll be back for our next episode. So until she returns, I wanted to bring you a conversation that I had with my longtime friend and colleague, Laura Dattner. And I talk a little bit more about Laura in the intro to the interview, but I did just want to note we are going to break this one into two parts. A lot of what Laura talked about in the second half of that interview is something Tracy's been wanting to discuss. So we're going to save that for the next episode. So again, Tracy will be back then. But for now, let's go ahead and get to part one. And as I said, I'll do a little intro to Laura at the start of this interview. So let's jump right in. All right. Well, our guest today is my longtime friend and colleague, Laura Dattner. And I have worked with Laura for 10 years now. We are both research writers with Tracy on our translational team. And I'm going to let her talk about her background and her bio. And, then we'll talk about, a range of other health com topics. But before we jump in, I just want to say that Laura has been a critical part of our team now for years. Tracy and I constantly joke about how we probably wouldn't get anything done without her because she is our queen of organization and our queen of spreadsheets and our queen of snacks. And so she has got all the important roles. But, what she's really here to talk about today is her view of health comm, what works and doesn't, and how she learned those things. And so welcome, Laura. And, let's start at the beginning. How did you get to health comm?
So when I was a teenager thinking about what I wanted to be when I grew up, I knew that I wanted to do something in like marketing, advertising, public relations, something in that world. But as I went into college, I was enrolled in an undergrad program in a business school. I realized that the corporate world really wasn't for me. So I really liked writing and kind of the marketing, advertising, PR side of things, but I didn't want to work for a corporation. I didn't want to be like selling things as my job. So I was a junior in college. I was taking a psychology of advertising course from Brian Southwell, your last guest.
Thank you again, Brian Southwell.
And we were reading a chapter, an article, something about one of the 90s CDC campaigns. And it was, I was looking for it and I can't remember if it was like, this is your brain on drugs, or use your head, wear a helmet, one of those big public health campaigns from the 90s. And I'm reading this and I remember finishing the chapter and running out to my roommate and being like, this is what I want to do when I grow up. I don't know what this, using air quotes, I don't know what this is, but like, this is what I want to do. And so after I told my roommate, I went to Brian's office hours and told him, this is what I want to do when I grow up. How do I do this? How do I get there? And he encouraged me to stay in school, to go to grad school and do a health communication or mass communication public health grad school program.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I did. I stayed, went to the University of Minnesota, go Gophers, for college and stayed there for grad school. Brian happened to be my grad school advisor. And I got a master's in mass communication with a public health minor. So I call it kind of my choose your own adventure health communication track.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people our age in this field do tend to be a little more that way. It wasn't a direct route here. Although I will say, we do see a lot of public health students, who are just discovering health comm is a separate field, or, that they need communication skills to be effective public health professionals in the future. So yeah, I think a lot of students feel the same way.
So when I was in college, I didn't even know what public health was. I didn't know that it was a field. I knew the CDC was a thing. I knew that states had health departments, but I didn't really know what they did, what their role was. I think that's true for a lot of us, especially pre-pandemic. So when I was in grad school, I worked at the Minnesota Department of Health. I was there for about 5 years. And I worked in cancer control. And I was with a group of probably 40, 50 people nurses, social workers, community health educators, patient navigators, those types of things. And I was the only communications person in that section on cancer control. And so I quickly became like, oh, we have, at that point in time, it was newsletters. We want to start a YouTube channel. Like, you're a communications person, do this. And I was, in grad school in my early 20s and was like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know more about health communications than pretty much anybody else that I worked with. So I was kind of the default person to do the communications work. And I loved it. I was at the Minnesota Department of Health for about 5 years, and I left to go to the Ohio Department of Health. I wanted to be closer to my family in Ohio, and I worked there for a couple years. Really didn't enjoy my job there. It was really challenging for the wrong reasons. And so I found myself in child injury prevention in my current position. And that was one where, like, I read the job description. It was for a research writer, and the primary tasks were like getting the research out of the journals and into the hands of the public. So writing press releases and doing really like getting research out to the public. And I hadn't really done that before, but I had worked in public health and I had worked in health communications research. And it seemed like I could do that job. And so I applied and interviewed, and here we are. And then my job has changed a whole lot. Um, I didn't, as much as I didn't know that public health was a field, I also didn't really realize that injury was a field, or that child injury prevention was a field.
Yeah.
So I think that's really common.
Yeah, I know that I never expected to be in this field, and I don't think that a lot of people that are in this field expected to be here. And, we probably did get here through a similar route, had a mentor or, knew somebody who was doing it. But this angle of public health is one that I can remember years ago, hearing from one of the interns. She's been a public health student, just had never really thought of it. And so I do think it's interesting you mentioned there at the end how much your job has changed. And so I think it's going to be a good thing for our listeners to hear, what were we doing kind of maybe 10 years ago when you started that was a part of your position that you're not doing now? What are things that you've picked up? What do you mean by your job has changed?
Sure. So when I initially started, my first year, I remember like we had two big research papers that came out. One was about looking at dishwasher detergent packets and laundry detergent packets, and kind of which one was more harmful to children, kind of the trends in poisoning among those two products. And then we had another paper about liquid nicotine, kids unintentionally getting into liquid nicotine and kind of the dangers that can happen from those. And those both happened in 2016. And I was writing press releases and kind of helping our researchers prep for interviews, coordinating some media interviews, doing that type of stuff, getting some pages up on our website about it. And that was like my main job. Later that year, we had a colleague in the injury prevention field, Dr. Ben Hoffman, who's out in Oregon. He reached out to our center director, Dr. Gary Smith, because he had a resident who had seen a child ingest a laundry detergent packet and was like outraged that this child had such serious injuries and nobody really knew about the dangers of laundry detergent packets. So her mentor, Dr. Hoffman, knew that our center director, Dr. Smith, did research on this and just kind of said, let's do something about this. Like, let's do a campaign of some sort. So that was 2016. And we did this single day of action all about laundry detergent packets. And our campaign name was Pass on Packets. So the idea is if you have young kids in your home, don't use laundry packets, use traditional laundry detergent like liquid or powder.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here stunned at the fact that that was 10 years ago. Wow.
Yeah. So that program, we did that in 2016, and then nothing really happened to it for a few years. And then the year of the pandemic, 2020, our center director was like, he really wanted to kind of build on that program. And like recruit med students, residents, fellows from across the country to work on a child injury campaign, whatever the subject matter might be. And so in 2021, we partnered with the American Academy of Pediatrics, AAP, And we launched this program called Trainees for Child Injury Prevention, or T4CIP, that Tracy and I basically run. It's a national program. Our first year, we were like, yeah, we might get, I don't know, 10, 20 people interested in it. And I think we had about 60 or 70 people apply. And we accepted pretty much everyone who was eligible for the program. And then every year since then, we've had more than 100 people apply. We can only accept about 80 because we have mentors and we want to keep it, still a good, like, personal and solid mentoring relationship. But the program, we have 2 national campaigns every year, one in May and one in October, about a different child injury prevention topic. And we're teaching our trainees, and we have monthly trainings. We're teaching our trainees not just about child injury prevention, but also about health communication and advocacy. Like, we're training future pediatricians on how to do child injury prevention advocacy and helping make them better health communicators. So that takes up a lot of my time and energy, but it's a fantastic program that I absolutely love.
Yeah. And, with the next day of action here coming up in May, as we get closer, I think it'd be actually kind of interesting to talk about how, these campaigns are built and, how do you talk to medical trainees, residents differently about health communication than you might talk to public health professionals or people that are more in kind of the roles that we're kind of in. And so I do think that'd be a really interesting conversation. And so maybe we'll have you back on to help break that down. I do want to ask though, so you said something about how running programs is different than doing your media work. And so is there anything else, that you're doing now or that you didn't expect to do?
I'm going to rewind a little bit and say when I started, other than doing like the press releases and whatnot, I was also I was a ghostwriter for the 700 Children's blog, which is a blog that our hospital runs. That's the primary audience is parents and caregivers. So the first 2 years, I was a ghostwriter. So I was writing for sometimes Tracy, sometimes principal investigators or PIs, other researchers in our center, sometimes other doctors at the hospital who worked in injury prevention. And then a few years in, they decided that we could put my name on things. And so that was really exciting time for me that I get to author my own blog posts.
Hmm.
So I've enjoyed writing for the blog, and sometimes they ask me to write about specific topics, and sometimes I turn them down. Like, is it safe to eat yellow snow? So I have a great relationship with that blog editor, and so I can also come to her and say, hey, we're doing some research about this, or we have a campaign coming out about this. Can I send you a blog about this? Like, tell me what your deadline is. And she's almost always accepting. There's another blog at the hospital called Pediatrics Nationwide, which their audience is more clinicians and researchers. So it's more of a sciencey voice. And that blog is often interested in kind of the things that we're doing that we think are a big deal, but that are not going to be interesting for kind of the general public. So we're not going to work with media relations and do like a press release around it.
Can you give us an example of something that you might do for the public facing blog that you would not do for the like more physician and researcher blog? You talked about like laundry packets and some other things like that. So can you just give an example of again how you would, make the decisions on what messages go to which outlet?
Sure. So I'm going to go back to our laundry detergent example because I think it's a product that everybody uses and is familiar with. So when we initially came out with the research, we said parents and caregivers, if you have young kids or even young kids and maybe older adults with dementia or intellectual disabilities, don't use laundry detergent packets in your home. Use traditional laundry detergent instead. So packet or powder or liquids. So that's the message that we're telling to families. If we're talking to pediatricians, it's just make sure your families are aware of this. So pediatricians have so much to talk about to their families when they come in for well visits, and we're talking about safe storage. Maybe just including, safe storage means keeping things up, away, and out of sight. But what should we be keeping up, away, and out of sight? So all the cleaners in your home, even if they're natural, even if they're maybe let's see, like we know to keep oven cleaner or bathroom cleaners locked up away and out of sight, but maybe just reminding our parents that dishwasher detergent packets and laundry detergent, whatever form you use, also needs to be stored up away and out of sight. The laundry detergents were interesting because we were also trying to reach policymakers and industry with that as well. And so our message for them is a little bit different. To them, we're talking about how we want their packaging to be changed, what safety standards they should have to reach. Sometimes we have to create safety standards, right? Or lobby for safety standards to be created to help keep our kiddos safe.
Yeah, I think that really gets to one of the questions that I think we get asked a lot, which is how do we determine what messages we're actually going to use? And most of the time, at least in my work, I'm just talking to parents or caregivers or the public, and so I love that you also get to kind of go a different route and appeal to kind of different pieces of some of the work that we do. And I think about the physician side and how a lot of them are interested in the actual toxicology, not just the recommendations on how to keep your kids safe from laundry packets. And so what I think is really hilarious about this too is that my mom is actually a practicing physician here in Ohio, and she gets some of the publications that you're talking about, and it's the only place I interact with them. So it's kind of funny to see her stuff out in the wild, and I go home to my parents' house, and there's an issue of one of the hospital products, and it is one of our investigators, and I'm usually assuming that you had a hand in that, Laura. So it's just fun to see, not only our work out there and like the kind of super practical tips that we put out for parents and the public, but also, your advocacy work. And also, sometimes it is also about the science.
It is fun. Yeah. I think like as a mom of two young kids, I ask our kids pediatrician questions all the time, and he's always saying, what's evidence-based, or there's been research that's come out on this that says XYZ. And so just, I think a huge part of my job is knowing your audience. And we talk about that in all of our communications training, our media training, that knowing your audience is where you have to start with any campaign.
I would hope that the listeners of this podcast, have taken that away, if nothing else. Right. Yeah. So, I actually want to circle back for a second about something that you mentioned earlier, and that was that you have a good relationship with our hospital marketing team, and especially with the blog editor. And I think you've heard this question a lot. I've heard this question a lot. People ask for advice on how to go about building that type of relationship. How do you connect with whomever is doing that kind of work in your institution? And so, what advice would you give to somebody who's looking to connect with marketing or PR or advocacy, that kind of thing within their institution?
Sure, that's a great question. I think that's really important for kind of long-term relationships. So some of it is going to overlap with just being a professional, responsible, respectful coworker. So if someone reaches out to you, be responsive. Don't, leave them unread. Be responsive to them and also respect their deadlines or their timelines. So whether it's a reporter or an editor for a blog or anything like that, most of the times they will reach out to you and say, "Hey, I'm looking for something on this topic. Can you get it back to me by the end of the week or over the summer or, in a couple weeks or something like that?" So be respectful of those timelines. And oftentimes the blog editor will reach out because the blog is something that can be very responsive, right? If there's, say, a social media challenge that is out and she's like, "I want something up this week about it. Can you write something for it?" I, will try to get back to her as soon as I see the email. And sometimes it's an easy, yes, I'll get something back to you this week. Sometimes it's, I'll get something to you, but I need to talk to an expert. And so my timeline is going to be dependent on when I can get that expert input or feedback on what I draft for you. Um, but either way, being responsive and respecting their timelines. If they don't give you a timeline, then be sure to ask, what do you need this by? Or I can do this by the end of next week. Is that soon enough for you? Or do you need it sooner or something like that?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Another part that I think is important to that conversation is it's okay to say no. I think a lot of times our researchers especially get really excited when someone from the media or someone basically who's not like them, who's not another researcher or physician, reaches out and wants to talk to them about their research. And it could even be like a high schooler who wants to do a project on something. It's okay to say no, whether it's not in your wheelhouse or you don't have the time or you don't think it's worth it to you to talk to them. You can say no. You can also push back and say, I don't really like this angle that you're taking. How about we talk about it like this instead and offer kind of an alternative that might be getting at what they're interested in, but at an angle that better fits your research style or kind of your own priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that point about it's okay to say no. Um, I know from working with researchers and scientists and the interns and stuff is that I think people just have a hard time saying no, especially as you said, if they're interested in your work, which is cool for a lot of people. And so knowing when to just flat out, kind of say no, versus no, but I can do something else, as you suggested, in a different frame or something else that is possible or just achieves mutual goals. Or is it a full on yes, right? It could be kind of anywhere kind of in those options. And so um, I think that for me, especially, I think about the fact that I'm not a media person. And so if I were in that researcher's shoes, I got a kind of phone call about a media interview. Honestly, I don't know that I'm the right person, especially for like an on-camera thing. That is just not going to be my wheelhouse, as you said. And so I would really then want to be able to say, no, I'm not going to be able to do that. But here, I'm going to connect you with, somebody else, maybe on my paper or at the hospital, or in our case, in our center, we have other people that can speak on these things. And so if you can't do that, is there a different option, a different frame, kind of a different idea that you can offer up as you said, to achieve everybody's goals?
Yes, absolutely. I think those are good points. And sometimes it might take a little bit of creativity, thinking about their question and how maybe it's not, well, I could answer your question, but I don't want to.
Yep.
But you come back and say, how can I answer your question in a way that benefits both of us, in a way that helps both of us?
Yeah, having been through, I think, all of the iterations of our Media 101 and 201 training since they've been done, and as somebody who's not um, super comfortable, being interviewed or definitely not on camera, I think one of the most valuable things that I've learned as part of the trainings that you and Tracy do is um, how to sit with the discomfort, first of all, the stress of it, but also how do you get back to the things that are important that I want to say, or that I think my audience really wants to hear. And so I remember one of the examples is the researcher who's kept being asked questions that weren't really aligned with her talking points, and so she was just really able to bring things back around and say, that's a good question. But we didn't look at that. Here's what we did look at. And, just again, I think media training is just so important, especially for those of us that aren't really comfortable doing this or aren't natural doing it. That practice and learning those techniques will help you be in the moment and have a good interview and be confident working with the media and your media team.
Yeah, that's called the bridging technique, figuring out how you get from what somebody is asking you to what you want to answer. And I think that's really important. Something else that kind of leads to is keeping in mind that when you're working with a blog editor or a reporter, a journalist, they are experts in what they do, right? So they are journalists or editors, but they are not experts in what you do. They're not experts in public health or in the medical field or in whatever specific program or topic you are working on. So it's your job, and hopefully you can work with them to figure out how to make your message relevant to their audience.
Yeah. Once again, I know that that's something that can be really tough if you haven't done it before, but there really are so many great resources and trainings out there now. And, talk to your institution and again, make friends with these departments because they're there to help you, um, you know, achieve those mutual goals. And the better the working relationship, the more frequently they'll reach out to you, if they're in need of content themselves. So, wins for everybody. Now, I do want to shift topics here because there's a couple other things I want to talk about, and then the next one is how there's kind of an interplay for those of us in health communication between being able to draw on experience versus when we have to message for something we don't have experience in. So, I don't have kids. When you first started, you didn't have kids either. And so I think about the fact that, our primary audiences are in many cases parents and caregivers and people like that. But you are now a parent yourself. And so I guess I wanted to just kind of ask about, you know, how being a parent has changed the way maybe you approach not only kind of what we do in child injury prevention, but maybe kind of health comm in general.
Sure, that's a great question. So when I first started working in child injury prevention, I was not only was I not a parent, but I didn't have anybody close to me that had young kids. So my best friend had a baby about 6 months into my job. My brother and his wife had a baby a couple years into my job. So I was an auntie. And anytime we would do research that came out affecting real little kids, I would, be texting them or emailing them like, hey, have you enrolled your kid in swim lessons? Have you started storing your things up away and out of sight because your kids are newly becoming mobile? And I just kind of took that responsibility of, protecting my niece and kind of honorary nephew of my best friend's son. I became a mom right before the pandemic. So my oldest child, my son, was born in February of 2020, about 6 weeks before the world shut down. And so I now have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old at home. And I have really found in both parenting and in health communications, a lot of the communication skills that I have worked on for my work are transferable to parenting skills. So I just think there's a lot of parallels there.
Amazing. That's hilarious.
One of the things that I've been thinking about this is, planning for the podcast with a 2-year-old screaming into my ear. She has really strong opinions, right? But she does not have all the words yet. She's still working on her communication skills. And I feel like sometimes that's how public health or medical professionals are. Like, we really want you to do this, and we have our reasons why we want you to do this, but we might not quite know how to communicate that.
No, no, you're totally right. I'm loving this analogy.
So that's where I think like needing to have clear messaging, consistent messaging is so important for building trust with our audience and also influencing positive behavior change. So some of that clear, consistent messaging that I found that I want to do both in my work as a health communicator and in my, other job as a parent is sharing a positive message. So we always say, tell people what you want them to do rather than what you don't want them to do. So emphasizing the positive. So like if I tell my kids, no throwing, stop throwing, all they hear is throwing or don't throw that. They're just going to hear throw that. Right. So instead of saying that, I will say toys stay on the floor. So in my work, rather than saying, don't store your medications within reach of your kids, I'm going to say, store your medications up, away, and out of sight. So it's the same message. We're just communicating it in a more positive way.
Yeah, I think the other important point I really want to kind of pull out of that is that when you only tell people not to do something, they're left with a vacuum around, or what they should do instead.
Yes.
And that is where I think as public health professionals and, especially in child injury, which is what, you and I are in, we don't always have the messaging or the evidence to say what to do. In many cases, it's framed in a sense of, the numbers and kind of, who it's happening to and where it's happening and those kinds of things. And I remember early on in this job going to Tracy and saying, okay, well, we have all that information. How are we supposed to tell them what to do? If we know this is a problem, we know, again, who it's happening to and where it's happening. How do we know then what to put in this press release or this newsletter or this graphic about this issue? And that's where we as health communicators come in, is that we do take that best evidence. We look at those mechanisms and then we kind of stand in the shoes of our audience. That's why audience is so important, to try to figure out what might work to address some of the kind of known mechanisms that we know are working in this particular issue that might be relevant to the audience. But, one of the things that we have always done, and Tracy has stressed from the very start, is again that concept of, you cannot just tell people what not to do. You have to give them an alternative. You have to help them either find a safer alternative, or if they're going to choose the activity, how can we at least do it as safely as possible?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. One of the things that we're struggling with right now is, I guess we often struggle when there's an emerging trend in injuries. So the last few years, we've seen a huge increase in injuries from e-bikes and e-scooters. And so we're planning campaigns now, and there's not really clear messaging. There is clear messaging that e-bikes are dangerous for kids, but there's not clear messaging on how to make them safer. There's every state, every city has different guidelines, if they have guidelines at all, on who can ride what type of e-bike, where they can ride it, if they need to wear a helmet, what type of helmet they need to wear, if there's any other protective equipment, other laws, all sorts of things. That is so variable across the country. And so as we're trying to design a campaign, we're really trying to clarify what is that clear, consistent message that we want to get across about, if your kid is going to ride an e-bike, here's how to do it safely.
Yeah, that is one thing that we do that I think does set us apart a little bit, is that, we absolutely start with AAP policy and, the data and the recommendations. But we also are looking at what's happening around us and what people are actually doing, and try to work on those gaps. Golf carts is another great example. AAP policy says, anybody younger than 16 shouldn't be driving these, which, fair. But in my own community, I'm seeing drivers definitely younger than 16 driving them, and people aren't wearing seatbelts and things like that. So, maybe we can try to do some education and outreach around that. All right, that's where I'm going to pause this conversation and keep the rest of this interview for part 2. Again, Tracy really had some interesting thoughts on something very similar to what Laura's talking about. So make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast, wherever you're listening, to get a notification when part 2 drops. And it always does help to like and comment on this if you're able. And again, sharing with people who might find it interesting is just always appreciated. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.